Hello and welcome to a special People and Profit. I'm Marcus Carlson and we are in Washington, D.C. for a look at some of the economic issues that will shape the race for the White House. Coming up in the show, anger and the economy. Voters in Pennsylvania tell us the rich are getting richer while the poor are getting poorer. We speak to the respected economist Adam Posen about whether a higher minimum wage makes sense for America. Plus, trade talk. Is foreign commerce helping or hurting the U.S. economy? The U.S. economy has grown at a steady pace in recent years, and the jobless rate has dropped to 5%, which from a European perspective is enviable. But many American voters still say that the state of the economy will be a key concern in the November election. And for many American families, wages have failed to keep up with the higher costs of living, and there is a debate here whether or not the system is rigged in favor of the rich. Our correspondents Gallagher Fenwick and Philip Crowther traveled to Pennsylvania to gauge the mood of voters there.
The angry American voter has arrived on the political scene. He or she could decide this election and has already got rid of many more traditional presidential candidates. Theirs is not a vote for a particular candidate. Rather, it's a vote against the political establishment. The angriest of them all, so say the polls, is the white working class man.
They're making their pockets rich, that's about it. And these president and all, if they're not millionaires when they get in, they become millionaires. Of course, that's the way it is. They ain't gonna change that. Oh, I can't get this damn line on.
After decades of service, the car repair shop is about to close its doors. The veteran mechanic says the profits aren't there. The economic recovery is nowhere to be seen.
We were other places, then we moved up here for the last 30 years we're here. So that's the end of the road, put it that way.
This is a community that largely lived off the local industry. And with the steel plants now completely closed, well, that is where politics comes in. And there's a lot of anger here and a desire for change in this presidential election of 2016. Hundreds of thousands of disgruntled Americans who had never voted before feel they have found their voice, and it's being heard far and wide this primary season. Crystal and Jose Garcia are both jobless. Their vote is for Donald Trump.
Jose says Trump is the solution. What do you say?
I probably have to go with him also, because I think he'd be the one to stand up for the people and do the best that any of them are going to do for us.
In most of the industrial states, Donald Trump has won the Republican primaries with big margins. The same also largely goes for Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side.
Let's talk more now about the state of the U.S. economy. We've come to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I'm sitting down with its president, Adam Posen. Thank you, Adam, for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Now, from a European perspective, the U.S. economy seems to be doing swimmingly. But how would you characterize it?
I would characterize it as the clear winner of the least ugly contest. So it's not beautiful compared to its past, it's not beautiful compared to some ideal, but it's definitely got fewer problems than all of Europe, essentially, or most other parts of the world.
But growth is still somewhere in the vicinity of 2%
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
thereover, which is good.
Absolutely. We've got 2% growth. We're closing in on full employment. Unemployment as measured is 4.7% roughly. Inflation is low, but not in deflation. It's been staying above 1.5%. And interest rates are low. So, in a sense, it's Goldilocks, but it's Goldilocks with not terribly tasty porridge, because we were used to a period when growth was 2.5%, 3%, and 2% is probably as best we can do now.
There's a lot of talk of voter anger ahead of the U.S. presidential election. How do you, as an economist, look at that?
Well, clearly there is a set of people who are particularly angry, who are mostly white males of lower education. And they are the people who've seen their relative status decline the most in the economy. It's partly an economic thing that as the economy and the world have advanced, that there's less use for low-skilled labor and less relatively high wages for people who do that. But it's also, unfortunately, I think, a social thing that as women, as people of color, as immigrants, have competed successfully with some of these people, they resent it. So it's not just economic. That said, the background is the U.S. remains the most unequal of all the major democracies.
What's happened to income inequality during the 8 years or so that Barack Obama has been in charge? There was a lot of talk of change back in 2008. Have we seen any change?
Unfortunately not. I don't think it's for lack of trying by President Obama and his team. I think part of it is they were facing an uphill battle with Congress that wasn't going to let them make the changes to the tax code. They did make probably the most significant change they could. There are now tens of millions of people who have health insurance who didn't. And though that doesn't show up in the income statistics, that's perhaps the biggest thing they could have done for people's security and safety.
If we look at some of the things that could be done in order to crack down on income inequality, there's talk of a higher minimum wage, and there is a campaign for a higher federal minimum wage. What would the right level be, and is that a good idea?
You know, this is one of those things where the basic economics tells you if you make the minimum wage too high, people are going to lose their jobs. There won't be as much demand for the labor. There is good evidence to suggest in certain locations and certain areas you can get away with paying a higher wage. We've published on this, as well as many labor economists, that you can get better motivation, less turnover from low-wage employees if you pay them a decent living wage. But you know, one has to be careful and judicious about this. So there are huge wage gaps geographically in the U.S., so you would really not want to have a high minimum wage uniform across the U.S. That would probably not be a good idea. In places like San Francisco or New York, where there's huge concentrations of wealth and a lot of demand, then you could understand a high minimum wage.
What would your piece of advice be to the next president of the United States, wherever it is, or whoever it ends up being?
I think the biggest advice you have to do is, first, do not raise the issue of rolling back Obamacare and the insurance. It's good for the economy, it's good for the budget, it's good for human beings. So agree that that is settled. Second, on the economy, try to get a responsible budget through the Congress, and this is not entirely up to the president. The Congress has to do their part. And a responsible budget would be one that involves broadening the base for corporate taxes and getting rid of a bunch of loopholes and raising some taxes on certain people. And thirdly, on the international side, try to pass the TPP trade legislation, not because it's going to be a huge benefit to the U.S. or a huge cost, but because it provides a path for other poor countries to be oriented towards the U.S. and play by good rules.
Adam Posen from the Peterson Institute, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
Thanks for having me.
K Street is the center of Washington's lobbying industry, and the avenue has been nicknamed the Power Corridor. And one of the hot topics for lobbyists this year is foreign trade. This is Donald Trump says that he wants to tear up a North American free trade agreement, and Hillary Clinton is opposed to a free trade pact with Asia. This whole debate has been fueled, at least in part, by several American high-profile companies moving their manufacturing abroad.
For Lionel Agnello, it truly was America's favorite cookie. He and 600 other employees at Nabisco used to make Oreos in a Chicago factory, but then management decided to move production.
Leaves a sour taste in my mouth because they're moving my job to Mexico. They have released me as of March 23rd of this year. I no longer have a job.
The plant had been making the iconic snack for over a century. But the company says the move will save $44 million every year. And cookies aren't the only ones emigrating. Ford is building a new auto plant in the state of San Luis Potosi, which could cost 700 American jobs. And air conditioning and heating giant Carrier shocked the country with the announcement that they were laying off 1,400 people.
Business for long term is to move production from our facility in Indianapolis to Monterrey, Mexico.
Mexico's proximity with the U.S. means cheaper transportation costs. And on average, a Mexican worker costs 20% less than an American one. On top of that, the Mexican peso lost 30% on the dollar, making goods made in Mexico more competitive. Barack Obama has often championed the Made in America label, but the business community has not followed suit. Over the last 10 years, the number of factories on American soil has fallen by 50,000.
As manufacturing takes a tumble, what about the bigger picture? Is the American economy as a whole benefiting or not from foreign trade? Stephen Carroll is crunching the numbers back at the studio.
Marcus, the United States is the world's biggest exporter of goods and services, worth over $2.3 trillion in 2014. The Trade Representative's Office says that more than 11 million American jobs are supported by exports and 1 in 4 positions in manufacturing. Exports accounted for some 13% of America's GDP in 2013. But it's not all good news. Research by the economist David Autor found that between 1999 and 2011, 2.4 million American jobs had been lost to China. Meanwhile, a paper from the Economic Policy Institute found that over 680,000 jobs were lost in the 6 years following the signing of a free trade deal with Mexico. Now, in theory, these workers should find new jobs in different sectors that are growing, but in practice, many of them find it difficult to find new positions. Now, when it comes to free trade deals, the effects are unclear. A promised boom in US exports after a deal was signed with Mexico didn't materialise because Mexico had its own economic crisis the following year. Changes in currency values can also mean that American goods simply become too expensive for consumers in other countries. And it's also difficult to distinguish the effect of technology on jobs versus positions actually being moved abroad. But trade is a reality of a modern economy, and managing it is an imprecise science. Manufacturing jobs tend to move to where wages are lower. Now, trade deals can help to mitigate that. The Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, for example, requires minimum wages in places like Vietnam. That means a better life for workers as well. The alternative, trade tariffs, are difficult to impose and can easily mean price rises for consumers on imported goods. If the US was to turn its back on free trade, it could be very costly.
We've come to the end of this edition of People and Profit from Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching. And if you have any comments or questions for us, go to our Facebook page, France 24 Business, or tweet me at MarcusF24. Goodbye for now.